very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hook, the reason that Senator Udall is asking you questions about Rudy Giuliani's requests on behalf of Reza Zarrab, I think is twofold. One, we are very concerned that there is a shadow foreign policy operation that exists being conducted by the president's personal lawyer, a representative of his political interests. We know that because we have transcripts of phone calls in which the president tells foreign leaders not to call your boss, Secretary Pompeo, if they want to deal with the United States, but to call Rudy Giuliani. But we're also concerned about this particular case because it seems as if it is evidence that the president's personal lawyer, his shadow Secretary of State, is working to undermine American sanctions against Iran, the very sanctions that you testified to us that are crippling their economy. And so let me ask Senator Udall's question a different way. Have you spoken to Rudy Giuliani about U.S. sanctions policy towards his client, Reza Zarrab?
This meeting was a couple of years ago. I was in listening mode. As I said, Judge McCasey asked for the meeting and listened to what they had to say, and there was no action taken.
But you did have a meeting with Rudy Giuliani specific to his representation of a client who is seeking to get out of U.S. sanctions.
No, I had a meeting with Judge McCasey, who was the lead, and Judge McCasey raised a consular issue with me, and there was no action taken.
There is a report from 3 people familiar with a meeting between President Trump and Secretary Tillerson, who you were working for at the time as perhaps his closest advisor, in which President Trump asked for Secretary Tillerson's help to work to drop the case against Zarrab. Are you familiar with this meeting or the request that was made?
I was not familiar with the meeting.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I think it's important to set the broader record straight here with respect to some of the things that Mr. Hook has said about our policy vis-a-vis Iran and its connection to the recent developments in Syria. I appreciate that you do have a tough job to do, and I don't imagine that you would have given counsel to the president to abandon our Kurdish partners in Syria. But it is simply not credible to say that we didn't have a counter-Iran element to our Syria strategy. In fact, multiple individuals testified to that before this committee and would still testify to that before the committee. It is not credible to say that abandoning the Kurds doesn't change the efficacy of our Iran strategy. Iran absolutely benefits, unequivocally, from a new alignment inside Syria in which the Kurds are forced to align themselves with Bashar al-Assad. And it is also not credible, it just doesn't pass the straight face test, to try to convince us that Europe is helping us with a maximum pressure campaign on Iran. And to the extent that I have a question on these topics, I'll give you one to try to clarify the record. I know you have this list of actions that Europe has taken, but let's be honest. Europe is attempting to work around our sanctions. Europe is trying to create financial vehicles so that their businesses can continue to trade with Iran. They're talking about a new line of credit to prop up the Iranian economy. They still have diplomatic relations. I mean, it just doesn't pass the laugh test to suggest that the Europeans are working with us. And so I just want to put this question back to you again. I mean, are you really trying to convince us that the Europeans are assisting in our maximum pressure campaign when we know that they are actively engaged in trying to help their businesses work around U.S. sanctions?
So you said that Europe is working around our sanctions, and I think maybe just to be a little more precise, European companies is what we're talking about. European companies have made a clear choice to choose the United States market over the Iranian market. The EU does more trade with Kazakhstan than it does with Iran. It's not even in the top 30 of trading partners. And so we have seen nothing but full compliance by European companies on our sanctions regime. European governments are frustrated that Iran has lost some of the benefits under the Iran nuclear deal with our departure. But that is a secondary consequence. As it pertains to European companies, there's no daylight. There's more daylight between European companies and European governments than there is between the U.S.
Right, but I think what you were you were sending us a list of actions that European countries had taken. And
Yes,
I think it just strains credibility to suggest that you have had success in convincing other nations, especially those in Europe, to rejoin the pressure campaign. The pressure campaign is unilateral. It is not as effective as it could be if you were successful.
So our unilateral sanctions have been much more effective than the multilateral sanctions that were in place prior to the deal. Indisputable on that. The second thing is on the, so when you say it is true, and maybe this is just a matter of sort of making distinctions. There is our pressure campaign, and then there is Europe working to confront and address Iranian threats to peace and security. And sometimes those overlap and sometimes they separate. But when I look at this list of European actions, it is dozens of actions that, I mean, everything from, as I said, these statements. Austria, Belgium, France, and Germany exposed an Iranian plot to bomb an oppositionist rally in Paris, and they arrested several Iranian operatives. The Netherlands expelled 2 Iranian diplomats in connection with an assassination. The French foreign minister condemned Iran's attacks on U.S. diplomatic missions in Iraq. Serbia revoked visa-free travel for Iranian citizens. Belgium extradited. I mean, this is I would welcome you reading this. Europe has done a lot in the time that we have left the deal to try to raise the cost of Iranian aggression. They have not joined our maximum pressure campaign, but they have adopted our position that we need a new deal. And Boris Johnson said that the Iran nuclear deal is a bad deal with many, many deals.
I would just say, listen, the proof is in the pudding. Iran is not at the negotiating table. You have a year left on your term. Their malevolent activity in the region is worse than ever before. If you had evidence that all of these actions were bringing them to the table, we might be in a different conversation, but there is absolutely no evidence that this has actually gotten us to a point where you can effectuate a negotiated settlement, and you only have 12 months left on the term. We are just not going to get the agreement that you have sought with the time that you have left and without European partners. I know I'm way over my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No,